I still remember the smell of that Tuesday morning, the kind of sterile, citrus and bleach fragrance that hangs in the air of any well-run industrial cleaning facility, the kind I had spent almost 3 years pretending to enjoy while pushing a mop across endless stretches of waxed concrete. My name was Mark then, or at least that is what everyone called me, and I was 26 years old, and I had the sort of unremarkable life that nobody writes songs about, not even the sad ones. I had a small apartment on the 3rd floor of a brick building that had been converted from a hosiery factory in the 50s. I had a used Civic that smelled like old French fries and a gym membership I used mostly to hide in the sauna when I needed a place to think. I had a mother who called me every Sunday and a father who had not called me since the wedding I did not attend, and I had a pair of older sisters who sent me birthday cards with the wrong year stamped in the corner. I was, in every measurable sense, a man who had been told he was a man by everyone who had ever met him, and I had no reason at all to question any of it until a chemical drum slipped off a loading dock and rolled, with the slow inevitability of a family's worst secret finally spilling out, directly into my lap. The drum was steel, the size of a kitchen trash can, painted in government safety orange, and it bore a label so cluttered with hazard symbols that it looked less like a warning and more like a graphic design fever dream. We called the contents by an acronym that I've come to forget on purpose, something like DCF 9 or BCF 7, a detergent additive that the company had recently begun manufacturing under contract for a Mariner supplier overseas. I had been a night shift custodian there since I was 23, and by then my job had drifted from sweeping floors and emptying trash into the far more interesting world of helping technicians unload raw materials from freight containers. I had been issued a high-visibility vest, steel-toed boots, a pair of nitrile gloves, so thin they felt like a second opinion rather than a second skin, and a pair of clear safety glasses that fogged whenever I exhaled. I was standing, that Tuesday morning at a little past 4, on a loading dock that overlooked a parking lot mostly full of pickup trucks, when the drum began to roll. There was no warning. There was no shouting, no crane failure, no truck backing up too fast. The drum simply slipped. The chalk behind it, a small rubber wedge the size of my fist, must have been kicked out of place by someone walking past, and the drum tilted on the lip of the dock, hovered there for a moment like a marble deciding which way to bounce, and then tipped over the edge and dropped the 4 feet to the concrete below. It bounced twice, spun, and rolled toward me faster than I could think to move, because I had assumed, like an idiot, that anything that heavy would stop on its own. It did not stop. It struck my left shin with the patient, indifferent force of a thing that did not care whether I lived or died, and the seal on its cap, which had been slightly misthreaded by whoever had fastened it at the factory, gave up its fight, and the liquid inside poured out around the cap and slid down the side of the drum and over my boot and up the leg of my work pants like a tide that had been waiting for permission to come in. The liquid was clear, almost water-white, but it had the weight of syrup and the smell of nothing at all, which was the most unsettling part, because every chemical I had ever known carried some trace of who it was. Vinegar smelled sharp, ammonia smelled mean, bleach smelled righteous. This one smelled like the absence of smell itself, like the room had been robbed of its memory. I looked down at my soaked pant leg, expecting to feel the usual sting of an industrial irritant, the hot bite of a degreaser, or the cool numbness of a solvent, but I felt nothing. Not because my nerves had been overwhelmed, but because nothing was, in fact, happening to me. I was standing there with chemicals sloshing around my boot looking for an injury that did not seem to exist, and the only pain I felt was the dull throb of the drum itself, which had left an actual bruise on my shin the size of a fist. I should have gone straight to the supervisor. I should have peeled off the soaked pants and thrown them into the hazardous waste bin and reported the spill on the form I had been trained to use. I did none of those things, because something in me, some stubborn little engine of pride that has always been louder than the rest of me, insisted that I had not been hurt badly enough to deserve attention. I walked back to the break room, peeled off the wet pants, rinsed my leg in the sink, dried it off with paper towels, and pulled on the spare pair of coveralls I kept in my locker. The wet pants I stuffed into a plastic bag and tossed into the hazardous waste bin on my way back out. The rest of my shift went by the way shifts go when nothing disastrous has happened, slowly and then all at once. And by 6:30 I was clocking out and walking across the parking lot toward my Civic, and the only evidence that anything unusual had taken place was a faint pale streak on the shin where the drum had hit me. I did not mention it to my mother that Sunday. I did not mention it to my sisters in their cards. I did not mention it to my doctor, because I had not gone. What happened next I cannot pretend to understand, even now. Within 72 hours of the spill, the bruise on my shin had faded, and a new thing had begun. The skin on that shin, exactly where the drum had struck, was smooth in a way that skin on a man's shin is not supposed to be smooth. There was no hair. There had been hair. There had been a coarse thatch of dark hair on that leg since I was 16, the kind that returned every time I shaved it with the cheap disposable razor I kept in the shower, and suddenly, that Tuesday morning a week after the spill, when I dragged a razor down that leg because pool season was coming and I liked the way a freshly shaved leg felt against sheets that I would never show anyone, I found that there was nothing to shave. The hair simply did not come back. I waited a week. I waited 2 weeks. I checked in the mornings and I checked at night, and I rubbed the skin between my fingers looking for the bristly stubble that always announced itself within 48 hours of a shave, and there was nothing. The other leg, the uninjured one, was as coarse and ordinary as it had always been. Only the spot that had been struck had gone quiet. I told myself, for a while, that this was a coincidence. I told myself that shins are complicated parts of the body, and that skin does strange things sometimes, and that men who shave their legs for some reason or another occasionally discover patches that simply do not behave the way the rest of the patch behaves. I told myself a lot of things. I told myself so many things, in fact, that for the better part of 3 weeks I did not look at the rest of my body, and I did not notice that the same smoothness had begun, slowly, like a rumor in a small town, to spread. The first place I noticed it next was my forearms. I had always had thick dark hair on my forearms, the kind that caught summer light and made my arms look bigger than they were, and I liked them that way because the gym guys I sometimes lifted weights with had the same arms, and I had wanted to be like them since I was old enough to read the backs of magazines. The hair on my left forearm, the arm closest to the spill, began to thin. Not overnight, not dramatically, but at the rate at which a forest thins when a disease has begun to move through it. Each morning I would look down, expecting to see the familiar dark thatch, and there would be fewer of them. By the end of the second week, the hair on that forearm was a light down. By the end of the third, it was barely there. I could see the blue veins underneath, and they looked, for the first time in my adult life, like something attached to a person rather than something attached to a piece of equipment. The hair on my right arm did not change. The hair on my chest did not change. The hair on my stomach did not change. Whatever the chemical had done, it was doing it patiently, locally, and at the speed of something alive, as if the cells in the places the spill had touched were being invited to reconsider their job descriptions and were accepting the invitation one at a time. I started around that time to wear long sleeves even in summer, and to keep my left arm tucked against my body in public, and to develop a habit of explaining away my own body to myself with the kind of conviction that only a terrified man can summon. I told myself the hair loss was stress. I told myself the smoothness was a fluke. I told myself, and this is the part one find hardest to admit, that the small softening of the skin on my left leg was only happening because I had been using a new lotion on it, because a coworker had given me a sample of something she kept at her desk, and I had thoughtlessly slathered it on the leg that had been struck, because that leg happened to be the one I saw first in the shower. I did not, at that point, buy women's clothing. I did not, at that point, even contemplate buying women's clothing. I was still a man, in every particle of my self-conception, and the idea that a chemical could change what kind of man I was would have struck me as the kind of joke I did not have the patience to hear. What I did do, instead, was start to look more carefully at women. Not in the way I had always looked at women, which was the stare of a man who is curious and a little intimidated and a little bored. I started to look the way one looks at a person who has been left alone in a room with a flashlight and a stack of unfamiliar maps. I looked at how they stood. I looked at how they held their shoulders. I looked at how they moved their hips when they walked into a convenience store at 2 a.m. to buy milk, which was the kind of mundane moment that I had spent 26 years ignoring because I had been told that there was nothing interesting about it. I started to see for the first time that there was something interesting about it, that women moved through the world in a way that I had never been taught to see, and that the way they moved was, somehow, more like where the chemical had been moving me. The first time I put on a piece of women's clothing, I was alone in my apartment, and I was shaking so hard that I had to sit down on the edge of the bathtub. It was a pair of tights I had bought at a thrift store a year before on a lark because I had been reading an article about the history of undergarments and I had wanted to know what a pair felt like, and the article had been so detailed and the thrift store had been so quiet that I had simply walked up to the bin and bought a pair in my size without thinking too hard about what I would do with them. I had not done anything with them. They had lived, since then, folded in a shoebox in the back of my closet behind a stack of old textbooks I never opened. I pulled them out that night because I had been staring at my legs in the mirror for an hour and I had noticed, finally, that the smoothness I had been telling myself was only on the left leg had, in fact, moved up past my knee and was now creeping around the inside of my thigh like a slow tide, and I was, for reasons I could not explain, panicking, and the only thing I could think of doing that might slow it down was to cover the skin with something. I put on the tights the way a person puts on a piece of clothing they have never expected to wear. I rolled them up the way my sisters had taught me to roll up pantyhose when I was 12 and they had been getting ready for a dance, and I pulled them up the length of my leg, and I pulled them up the other leg, and I stood in front of the full-length mirror I had salvaged from a curbside on a Tuesday, and I looked at myself. The tights were black, and they covered me from the toe to just above the waist. Under the harsh bathroom light, the muscles in my calves were not as visible as they had been 5 minutes before. The hair that was still on my right leg pressed itself flat against the nylon in a way that was unsightly, and so I reached for the razor, and I shaved the right leg to match the left. The act of shaving my right leg felt, in a way I could not have articulated at the time, like an admission. I was, whether I wanted to be or not, dressing in women's clothing. I was standing in front of a mirror in women's clothing. The argument that I was only doing it to cover a medical condition did not really survive the first 10 seconds of contact with my own reflection. I sat down on the edge of the bathtub, and I put my face in my hands, and I tried to think. I tried to think the way I thought about anything that scared me, which was to imagine what the worst-case scenario looked like, and then to ask myself whether I could survive that worst-case scenario. The worst-case scenario, I decided, was that the chemical had done something to me that was going to continue happening, that the changes were going to keep coming, that I was going to keep looking more and more like a person who was not, by the public records of the state I lived in, the person I was supposedly supposed to be. The second worst-case scenario, I decided, was the realization that the worst-case scenario was not, in fact, a worst case. The second worst-case scenario was the realization that I had been waiting, somewhere in me, for the chemical to do what it was doing, and that the panic I felt was not about the changes themselves, but about the fact that I was not, in the way I had always imagined I would be in a moment like this one, fighting them. I sat with that realization for a long time, and then I took off the tights, and I folded them back up, and I put them back in the shoebox, and I went to bed. What happened over the next 4 months was not a single event, but a series of small negotiations with myself, each one of them barely noticeable at the time and yet, taken together, astonishing in their totality. The smoothness climbed from my left leg up past my hip and across the small of my back and into the groove of my waist. The hair on my chest thinned and then vanished. The hair on my stomach thinned and then vanished. The hair on my arms thinned and then vanished. And even the coarse hair on my forearms, the kind that was supposed to be permanent, began to disappear in the slow, patient way that the rest of it had disappeared, and I found myself, one morning in late June, standing in the bathroom with no shirt on at all, and noticing that the only hair left on my body was a thin line down the center of my stomach and a small triangle above my groin. The triangle softened and thinned. The line down my stomach vanished. I started to save less and less in the razor, because there was less and less to save. I started, around the same time, to put on weight in a different place than I had ever put on weight before. I had always carried my weight in my stomach and on my love handles, the typical distribution of a man who eats gas station pizza and lifts weights twice a week without ever really tracking the food. The weight that was arriving now was not going to my stomach. It was going to my hips. It was going to my thighs. It was going, in a way I found impossible not to look at, to my chest. I had read in a textbook in college that I had not particularly paid attention to that human fat distribution was a hormone-driven phenomenon, and that hormones determined whether fat went to the belly or to the hips or to the breasts, and I had not particularly believed it because I had not had any reason to believe it. I was believing it now. The jeans I had been wearing for 3 years had stopped fitting me around the waist, and yet they had also stopped fitting me around the thighs, and yet a pair of my sister's old jeans, which I had borrowed out of curiosity, fit in a way that made me sit on the edge of the bed and stare at the ceiling for the better part of an hour. I have never told anyone, and I may never tell anyone, the moment when I first put on a dress. It happened on a Sunday afternoon in August, almost 5 months after the spill. I was alone in the apartment. My mother had called, and I had not picked up. My sisters had sent me a birthday card, 2 weeks late, with a check inside, and the check had bought me, with a sort of mathematical inevitability that often passes for fate, a black cotton A-line dress from a department store in the mall that I had driven to in my Civic with the windows rolled up and the radio off. I had measured myself first, even though there was no measuring tape in the apartment. I had measured my bust with a piece of string from a kite I had flown as a child, and I had measured my waist with a string as well, and I had stood in front of the mirror for a long time trying to figure out what size I was, and I had decided that I was somewhere between a medium and a large in the dresses the store had on the rack, and so I had bought 2, in different sizes, in different cuts, in different fabrics, and I had brought them home, and I had hung them in the closet next to my work uniforms and my suits, and I had not taken them out again for a week. The day I took them out, the apartment was quiet, and the sun was coming through the window in a thin yellow band, and the Civic was parked downstairs where I had left it, and the world was, for the moment, behaving the way the world behaves when nobody important is watching. I unzipped the first dress from its dry cleaning bag. I held it up in front of me. It was longer than I had expected it to be, almost ankle length, and the color of it, against the white wall, made me think of something I could not quite name. I stepped out of my jeans. I stepped out of my boxers, which were, by that point, the only underwear I owned that fit me properly, because the briefs I had been wearing for 20 years had stopped sitting right around my hips. I stood in front of the mirror with the dress in my hand, and I looked at myself for a long time without putting it on. I was not, by the standards of any person walking past me on the street, an especially beautiful specimen of a man, and I was not, by my own standards, an ugly one either. I was just a man. A man with a slightly soft jaw and slightly tired eyes and a slightly crooked nose from a schoolyard fight I could not quite remember. I was a man whose body had begun, in a way I had not invited, to disappoint the categories I had been sorted into at birth. I put the dress on over my head. I had to wiggle into it, because my shoulders were still broader than the shoulders the dress had been made for, and I had to ask the zipper to come up the rest of the way by myself, which it did, with the help of a hair tie I had tied around the zipper pull. I stood in front of the mirror. The dress fell to my ankles. The waist of the dress hit me at the natural curve of my hips, which had begun to show, and so the silhouette of me in the dress was not the silhouette of a man wearing a woman's dress. It was the silhouette of a woman. A slightly taller than average woman, perhaps. A woman with shoulders that were a little wider than the average shoulders a dress like that one usually draped over. But a woman. The realization hit me with a force that I had not prepared for, because I had been preparing, since the first patch of smoothness on my left leg, for the worst-case scenario of being seen by some stranger as a woman, and I had been dreading that scenario. I had not prepared for the realization that being seen by myself as a woman felt, in the moment, less like a worst-case scenario than like an arrival. I sat down again, on the edge of the bathtub, and I did not put my face in my hands this time. I sat, and I looked at the dress, and I looked at the way the fabric fell across my hips, and I looked at the way the small softness in my chest pressed gently against the inside of the bodice, and I felt, for the first time in my adult life, that the thing I was looking at in the mirror was the thing I had been looking for my whole life without knowing it. The feeling was not joyful, exactly. The feeling was the feeling of an animal in a field that had always thought of itself as one shape, and that had looked down one morning and had discovered, to its great confusion, that it had grown another. There was no handbook for how to feel about it. There was no map for the territory. There was only the apartment and the mirror and the black dress and me. I started to dress in private every night after that. I started with the tights, which still lived in the shoebox, And then I put on a pair of panties I had bought at the same thrift store because they had been in a bin next to the tights and they had been inexpensive enough to dismiss as a curiosity. And then I put on a bra I had ordered online from a catalog I had found through a search engine I had not been using for any particular purpose. The bra had been a guess. The measurements I had taken had been a guess. I was a 42B, the size the catalog had told me I was, and the bra had arrived in a plain brown box that I had opened with a kitchen knife and had placed, with the reverence of a man handling a piece of evidence, into the drawer of my nightstand. I put it on, and the small softness that had been gathering at my chest fit into the cups with a small sigh. I was, again, looking at a woman in the mirror. A tall woman, with shoulders, but a woman. The first time I left the apartment in women's clothing was a Friday night in September. I had saved up the courage, the way a person saves up courage for any act of self-announcement, by taking small walks first. I had walked to the corner of the block in a pair of women's jeans and a loose sweater. I had walked to the convenience store 2 blocks down in the same outfit, and I had bought a bottle of water, and the woman at the counter had greeted me as ma'am, and the greeting had hit me in the stomach in a way I could not explain to anyone. And I had walked home with the bottle of water and the greeting, and I had sat on the couch for an hour trying to decide whether the greeting had been a mistake or whether the greeting had been the first correct thing anyone had said to me in 26 years. It had not been a mistake. The woman at the counter had seen me and had reached for the word she had reached for, and the word had been right. I dressed carefully that Friday night. I put on the black A-line dress and the tights, and a pair of low black boots I had bought at a thrift store on a different errand. I put on a wig I had bought online, a short auburn bob that had arrived smelling vaguely of hair product and that I had tried on in the bathroom and that had, against all my expectations, looked good. I put on a light coat of makeup I had learned to apply from a series of YouTube videos that I had watched with the kind of obsessive attention I had once reserved for football games. I stood in front of the mirror for 20 minutes, adjusting the wig, adjusting the hem of the dress, adjusting the way I held my shoulders, which had begun in the past few months, to drop into a softer position that I had not consciously chosen but that my body had remembered from somewhere I could not name. I looked, at the end of those 20 minutes, like a woman. A tall woman. A woman with a slightly long face, a woman in her late 20s or early 30s, a woman who had maybe worked a long shift and was on her way to meet a friend for a drink. I walked out of the apartment. I walked down the stairs. I walked across the small parking lot behind the building. I got into the Civic, which I had never expected to drive while dressed like this, and I drove the Civic to a bar downtown that I had never been to before, that I had chosen out of a guidebook, because it was the kind of place where a woman alone at the bar might plausibly be left alone by management. I parked the car. I walked into the bar. The bartender looked up, looked at me for a moment, and nodded. "What are you drinking?" he said. I ordered a drink I had never ordered before, something with gin and something green, and I sat at the bar, and I let the drink sit on the counter, and I let myself, for the first time in my life, be in public in a way that matched what was happening in my body. I did not feel exhilarated. I did not feel brave. I felt, more than anything, that I had arrived somewhere and that the arrival had nothing to do with courage and everything to do with the slow, patient work that a chemical had done on me and that I had been doing on myself, in private, for the better part of a year. I had not finished that first drink before a man came up to me and asked if he could buy me another. I said yes, and he introduced himself, and he asked me what my name was, and I told him a name I had been saving up for this purpose, the name I had written on a slip of paper and slipped into the pocket of the dress before I had left the apartment. The name was Mara. I am not sure where the name came from. I think it came from a song I had heard in a movie I had watched on a long flight when I was 19, and that I had remembered only as a feeling rather than as a plot. He called me Mara for the rest of the night, and I heard the name, and the name was right in the way the greeting at the convenience store had been right, and I left the bar that night with the name settled into me like a key into a lock. I went back to the bar the next Friday. I went back the Friday after that. I went back on Wednesdays, too, when the bar was quieter, and the bartender was the same bartender who had nodded at me on my first visit. He called me Mara by the 3rd week without asking, and I never corrected him. I had a small group of friends by the end of the autumn, friends who had only ever met Mara, who thought I was a woman who worked in a cleaning facility and who lived alone, and who had a quiet laugh and a habit of ordering the same gin and green thing every time. I had not yet decided what to do about work. I had not yet decided what to do about my family. I had not yet decided what to do about the person I had been before the chemical had come to find me, the person whose name had been Mark and who had spent his whole adult life trying to be a particular kind of man because that was what everyone had asked of him, and who had never really understood until the body had begun to remind him that the body had been trying to tell him something different the whole time. The hardest part of the transformation, I came to realize over the course of that autumn, was not the transformation itself. The body had done what it had done, and the body had answered questions I had not known I had been asking. The hardest part was telling my mother. My mother had been calling me every Sunday for 23 years, and I had picked up every time, and the conversations had been the conversations of a son with a mother who had raised him and who still thought of him, even after he had moved out and gotten a job and started a life, as a boy who needed reminding to eat vegetables and to wash his coat. My mother did not know. My mother thought I was her son. Telling her I had decided in late October was going to be the bravest thing I had ever done, and I was not going to do it alone. And so I made an appointment with a therapist I had found through an online directory that had been recommended to me by a woman at the bar who had noticed I was nervous and who had asked me if I had someone to talk to. The therapist's office was in a brick building on a quiet street, and the waiting room had a small plant on the windowsill and a single copy of a magazine I had never heard of. The therapist was a woman in her 50s named Dr. Yen, and she had a habit of letting me speak for a long time before she responded, and the first response she gave me, after I had told her about the spill, and the smoothness, and the hair loss, and the dress, and the bar, and the name, was to ask me how I felt when the bartender called me Mara for the first time. I told her, as honestly as I could, that I had felt that the bartender had been the first person who had really seen me. Dr. Yen nodded, and she wrote something down on a notepad, and she asked me whether I had told my mother yet, and I said no, and she said, "You don't have to tell her unless you're ready." And I said, "I don't know if I'm ever going to be ready." And she said, "Then we should probably start there." I told my mother on a Sunday afternoon in November. I drove to her house, which was 40 minutes away, in the Civic, dressed as Mara, and I parked on the street in front of her house, and I sat in the car for almost an hour before going in. My mother answered the door in an apron, because she had been baking, and she looked at me for a long moment, and she said, "Honey, are you one of Mark's friends?" And I said, "Mama, it's me," and she said nothing for a long time. She did not cry exactly. She did not faint exactly. She stood there in the doorway with her oven mitts in her hand, and she looked at me, and then she invited me in, and then she sat me down at the kitchen table, and then she asked me to start at the beginning. I told her the whole story. I told her about the drum and the spill and the smoothness and the hair and the tights and the dress and the bar and the name. I told her about the way the bartender had nodded at me on that first Friday night, and the way the woman at the convenience store had greeted me, and the way Dr. Yen had asked me how it felt. I told her that I did not yet know what I was going to do about work, and that I did not yet know what I was going to do about my sisters, and that I did not yet know what I was going to do about the legal name on my ID, but that I was, in the most essential sense of the word, her daughter, and that I wanted her to know that even if she did not know what to do with that information yet. My mother looked at me across the table for a long time, and then she reached across the table and she took my hand, and she said, "Honey, I have known since you were 4. And I've been waiting for you to know it too." And then she cried for the first time in a conversation we had ever had, and I cried with her, and the cookies she had been baking burned in the oven. And we did not turn the oven off for almost 20 minutes, because neither of us could let go of the other's hand. I have not yet told my father. I suspect I may not tell him. He stopped calling me when I was 23, and I do not think he earned, in those years, a vote on who I am. My sisters, who had sent me the late birthday card, called me the week after my mother found out, and they each, separately, told me that they had suspected something, and that they loved me, and that they wanted to come visit me in my apartment the next time they were in town, and that they were bringing their kids if I was okay with it, and I told them I was okay with it because I was, for the first time in a long time, okay with a great many things. The transformation did not stop with the clothes. The body, which had begun its work the moment the chemical had touched it, kept working. The hair on my head, which had been thinning at the temples in the way that the hair on a man in his late 20s sometimes thins at the temples, did not thin any further. The line of my jaw softened. The bone structure of my face did the small, patient work of resettling itself into a shape that was less square and more oval, and the small softness at my chest grew, slowly, into something that was not, by the standards of the women I had met at the bar, or the women I had worked with at the facility, particularly large, but that was, in the context of the bra I had bought at the catalog, exactly enough. I had been told by Dr. Yen that the body could do things that no hormone therapy could explain when a chemical of this kind was involved, and I had chosen, mostly on her recommendation, not to take hormones yet because the body was already doing much of the work on its own, and because there was, in me, a reluctance to interfere with what was happening. I changed my name legally 7 months after the chemical had come to find me. I went down to the courthouse and I filled out the form and I paid the fee, and I was told to come back in 2 weeks for the certificate. I came back in 2 weeks and I held the certificate in my hand, and the name on the certificate was Mara, and the name was right in the way that the bartender's first greeting had been right, and I walked out of the courthouse into the sun, and I called my mother, who cried again, and I called the bartender, who sent me a bottle of the gin and green thing to celebrate, and I called Dr. Yen, who told me she was proud of me, and I walked to the parking lot, and I sat in my Civic for a long time, with the certificate in my hand, and I felt, for the second time in my life, that I had arrived somewhere, and that the arrival was not the end of the journey, but the beginning of a much longer one. I have been Mara now for the better part of a year. I work at the same cleaning facility, although I have moved from the night shift to the day shift, and I work as a supervisor now because the way I had been treated on the night shift had changed in the weeks after I had begun to present as Mara, and the supervisors, who had been willing to overlook my unusual situation because I had been a reliable worker for almost 3 years, had offered me the promotion in part because they had been told by corporate that they could either promote me or have me leave, and they had preferred to keep me. I have not told the company about the chemical. I have not told my old co-workers about the chemical. I have told them that I had been dealing with a medical situation that had changed some of my physical features, and they have been, mostly, willing to accept that explanation, although there are a few of them who look at me in a way that tells me they suspect the explanation is not the whole truth. I have begun in the past 6 months to date. I had not dated as Mark. I had been too anxious, too unsure of who I was, too unwilling to let anyone close enough to find out. I am, as Mara, a person who is willing to be found out, and the first man I went on a date with was the man who had bought me the gin and green thing on my first Friday night at the bar, and we had, over the course of several dates, drifted into something that resembled a relationship, although we have not yet called it that, and the relationship, whatever it is, has been the clearest mirror I have ever stood in front of. He calls me Mara. He has not, as of the date of this telling, asked me what my name was before I was Mara, although I have told him I had another name, and he has not asked me what I was exactly, and I have in turn not told him the whole story. The story is not his, exactly. The story is mine. I have begun, in the past 3 months, to write this account. I am writing it because I have been told by Dr. Yen and by a small support group I have joined of other people whose bodies have decided, for one reason or another, to surprise them that telling our stories is one of the things that helps. I am writing it because I never want to forget what it felt like to stand in front of a mirror in a black A-line dress and to see a woman looking back at me. I am writing it because I want to be able to tell my children one day, if I have them, that their mother had been something else once, and that the something else had been okay, but that the something else had not been quite right, and that the chemical had come along, and the body had listened, and the rest had been up to me. I am writing it because there is, in this country, in this time, a great deal of fear about people like me, and the fear is mostly, in my experience, the fear of someone who is looking at a stranger and being unable to see past the categories they have been told the stranger belongs to. I was Mark once. I am Mara now. The categories I belong to as Mark have been mostly dissolved. I have new categories now, and the new categories are softer, and they fit me in a way the old ones never did, and I am, for the most part, a person who is willing to let the world catch up with me at whatever speed the world catches up with me, because catching up with me is not my job. My job, I have decided, is to be Mara, and to be Mara in public, and to be Mara in private, and to be Mara at the bar, and at work, and at my mother's kitchen table, and in front of any mirror that I happen to stand in front of on any given morning. The chemical, I have been told by the company that makes it, is no longer in production. The drum that spilled on me was one of the last drums they ever made. The Mariner supplier canceled its contract after a series of unusual incidents involving other workers at other facilities, none of whom, as far as I know, underwent the kind of transformation I underwent, and the company has been trying, quietly, to figure out what the chemical did to me without ever telling me, directly, what they have figured out. I do not particularly need them to tell me. The chemical did what it did. The body listened. The body is still listening. The hair on my scalp, which used to be thinning at the temples, has stopped thinning. The softness of my skin, which had been spreading patiently, has settled into the kind of skin that women I know at the bar seem to recognize on sight, as skin that has been touched by something they cannot name. I am not, by any stretch, what a person would call a model. I am a person who is tall, and who has shoulders, and who carries her weight in the hips the way the women in my family have always carried theirs, and who has a small softness at the chest that fits into a 42B bra, and who has, in her late 20s now, the kind of face that some people would call interesting, and that other people would call uneven. I have, in the past 6 months, lost the urge to explain myself to strangers. I have, in the past 3 months, begun to say, when asked the kind of question that strangers still sometimes ask, that I am a woman who has been a woman for most of her life and that the rest is none of their business. I have, in the past month, started to wear my auburn bob a little shorter than the wig had been, because my own hair, which had always been a darker brown, had begun to grow in a way that was softer and cullier than it had been as a child, and the simpler cut suited me. I have, in the past week, started to write this paragraph, which is the paragraph where I tell you, the reader of this account, the ending that the ending of any such account is allowed to have, which is not an ending at all but a continuation, and which is that I am okay, today, in the way that people who have arrived somewhere after a long trip are okay, which is to say that I am bruised and tired and grateful, and a little afraid, and that I am going to keep going, and that the going is not, in any way, over.